Hi, welcome to chatonthecouch.com. This is Des Futak here with Steve Smith, a very good friend of mine, and this week we are going to be talking about the very eye-opening and world-changing subject of philosophy. Now, before you switch off, Steve has got a really interesting take on this, and particularly in the context of how philosophy and relationships work together. And rather than me completely wrecking what he's about to say, I'm just going to pass over to you, Steve. So, Steve, just fire away. Tell me what you're going to say, and how does it all work?
Well, I'd really like to sort of introduce it via the background, really, which is obviously I become a Christian in the third year of a philosophy degree, which is probably quite unusual. But I was very interested in philosophy. The sort of questions that were being asked, the nature of reality, human understanding, and how it all kind of fits together. And I think I'd sort of, I'd come to this place through, in a sense, not holding on to any strong agendas, not coming up with strong agendas, and so I was very happy, really, just to do whatever. I wasn't really focused on doing this or doing that specifically, but just really wanting to be kind of led by God in it, really. And after I finished my philosophy degree, I was aware that there were unresolved issues within philosophy, which I think everybody would have acknowledged at the time. And interestingly, I think those issues are still, as far as most people are concerned, unresolved today.
Okay, tell us what they are.
A couple of years ago, the mother of one of the friends of our children, that's complicated, one of our children, who was doing a PhD at a university, said that these days arts departments and science departments are so far apart in terms of their worldviews, they can barely speak to each other.
Wow.
Which is, and I thought to myself, it's still, it still hasn't sort of really been sorted out. And this, so basically, what I thought I'd do is I would share my little contribution, and which I worked on in the early 80s, between 1980 and 1985. So that's kind of 30 years ago now. So I thought the first thing that would be helpful would be to give a little bit of a kind of outrageous potted summary of the history of philosophy, which is not one you'd find anywhere else, but it's kind of what I took from my philosophy degree as being the main really interesting things that then I was keen to see how you kind of work all that through into something that is sort of coherent and plausible. So, a brief history of philosophy, which invites the question, what is philosophy about and stuff. And there's a very interesting little book called Before Philosophy by Henry Frankfurt and Mrs. Frankfurt and a couple of other people, which talks about what the world is like in a sort of pre-philosophical way. And it's very interesting, and basically in ancient Egypt and the ancient world, but not interesting in ancient Israel, nor in ancient Greece once philosophy got going. The idea was that basically the whole world, that everything was perceived in a very sort of personal way. Not that everything was a person, not that chair is a person and that wall is a person, but actually that every encounter is unique and individual, and a fire might burn or not burn so much. It's kind of, there's sort of lots of agency at work. And just
there's a lot of subjectivity involved in
sort of, yes. And so just like, if you think of how you deal with people on a daily basis, and people have characters, and sometimes they're a bit out of character or definitely in character, and that's kind of how human relationships work. So it was with everything that people in the ancient world encountered. So you might want to do an offering to make the fire burn more strongly or something like that. Right. So everything was very personal and very individual. Right. And this event at this time is the focus, and they wouldn't sort of generalise out. So that's a sort of background, if you like, before philosophy. And what happened in ancient Greece, which was just obviously an amazing place where all these sort of things happened, but the big thing really was getting hold of maths and geometry in particular, because with maths you have, I suppose the sort of conclusion they sort of quickly came to that's important for philosophy is that actually the world is kind of deeply structured. There are deep structures in the world that sort of correlate with deep structures in the human mind. And that somehow through maths you can sort of work out kind of what's going on, and you can sort of reason your way to things that you can be very, very sure of.
Where did that idea come from? Because that's a radical departure from what you're describing leading into
Yeah,
that
absolutely. Well, I think they just discovered things like geometry and stuff like that, and they
Okay.
found that if you start off with something true and you reason your way forward, therefore, any conclusion you reach is also true in maths, and that is just amazing. That you start off with something and you reason using logic, therefore, and your conclusion is also true. And that is just amazing. And more than that, that the sort of mathematical sort of interpretation of reality overrides experience. So if, for instance, I said to you, Des, that this morning in my garden I planted some beans, and I planted 4 rows of 3, and I didn't miss any out, and at the end I counted them, and I planted 11 beans, you would say to me, no, you didn't. You planted 12. And I would say, no, but I counted them. And you would say, if you planted 4 rows of 3 and you didn't miss any out, you planted 12. And so to mean how powerful maths is. Now, if I said to you, I painted my door this morning and I painted it red, you wouldn't say, no, you didn't. You know what I mean? I mean, you couldn't do that. But maths, it kind of overrides experience. So powerful is it? And so it's not just that it's true, but it's sort of deeply true, overridingly true.
So it has a huge
trumps,
appeal.
It has a huge, and not just that it's sort of true in that way, but also it stays true.
Right.
So, you know, each day you don't need to sort of get out your beans and check that 2 out of 3 is still 5. It's kind of eternally true and powerfully true. And the thing about sort of being able to reason forward, as far as I know, you'll be able to put me right because you're much more of a mathematician than I am, but, you know, you could have a starting point, and you can go therefore, and you can go on sort of 200 pages, and it's a bit like light, as I think of it. Again, you know about this. There's no loss of energy at the end of 200 pages. It's still as fresh and raring to go as ever, and that's just amazing. So the ancient Greeks got really bowled over by maths, and what happened was that made them think, although reality as we encounter it seems a bit of a jumble, and everything seems kind of quite sort of chaotic and separate from everything else, actually, there are these deep underlying structures, you know, for instance, in maths and geometry of various kinds, which sort of, in some ways, are congruent with deep structures of the human mind. And as long as we start off in maths with something true, and as long as our logic is sound, we can move forward confidently forever.
Now,
knowing...
I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit, because this did get the Greeks into a little bit of trouble.
Oh, yeah, it did. But this is what I'm saying, is this is the starting point. This is what made them... I'm not saying this stands... You know... And what they did was, they then said, well, if it's like that in maths, it must be like that in everything else.
Right.
So they said, that's how science got going, you see. So they'd take look at some phenomena, and they would say, therefore, and they'd end up with this kind of understanding of what's going on. And it's the same also in law. Very, very often seems to start that way. You have your sort of the law that's passed, and people go therefore, and you can end up with something that's actually quite a long way away from your original law. But there's this sense of logic, in a sense, sort of seems to preserve truth. If you start off with something true and proceed logically, that sort of truth is somehow preserved in that chain of reasoning.
Yeah, I'm happy to go along with that, because although mathematics has evolved significantly since then, like you've got Gödel's incompleteness theorem and fuzzy logic,
and I know there are things at the edges.
There's still a vast body of mathematics that science and engineering relies completely on even today.
Yes. I mean, at its heart, that is true. Do you want to take a phone call? Or
No, we'll just carry on.
So at its heart, that I take it that's true. So the impact for philosophy was very significant, because in philosophy, what happens is that you start off kind of opposites with sort of stuff that everybody would say, yes, that's fine, and you go therefore, and at some point you, as it were, take off, and you go into the stratosphere, and you end up with stuff that is quite sort of abstract and quite removed from anything, and which is not checkable.
Right.
But you see, that was fine, because if you start off with something true, and your logic is sound, therefore, your conclusion will also be true, so it doesn't matter that you can't check it, because the truth is guaranteed by a true starting point and sound reasoning.
Now, are you saying you agree with that, or you're just explaining
I'm not.
it?
No, I'm just explaining. This is what the Greeks did.
Yeah.
And for 2,000 years, that's how everybody saw it.
Right.
And so with science, you didn't need to do it. The only people... It's like with maths. You know, imagine a child who every time they did a maths sum, 5 add 3 is 8. Every time they needed to get out the beans to check it, that would, normally show they didn't quite understand how maths works. Actually, you don't need to check it. That's the whole point. It's kind of guaranteed. In the same way, science, you didn't need to check it because it was just sort of guaranteed, really, through sort of sound reasoning.
And obviously, what came along was the scientific revolution, where
absolutely,
people
that's the next thing we come to. That's actually So the first thing, the Greek thing, is this thing about maths and the power of maths that is probably still true for maths in largely. But they thought it applied everywhere. Science, philosophy, ethics. It's very interesting. I heard somebody talking recently and saying about Immanuel Kant. See, he had this view. He worked out, therefore, however you should behave in every situation. So if the Mad Axe murderer turns up at your door and says, I want to kill this guy, where is he? You should tell the truth. You should say he's hiding in the toilet.
Right.
Yeah. And he was challenged by this, apparently, in a letter to a friend. And Immanuel Kant basically said, no, I've worked it out. This is what you have to do. And to me, that's exactly the same as the maths thing.
Right.
I've got the beans in my garden.
Yeah.
And even if everything in you says, no, actually, it's the power of this...
Power of logical reasoning.
Takes you to that point. And there's the same sort of confidence in sound starting point, lots of logic, and there you are.
Right.
So it's that sort of mathematical thing that, in a way, has always been at the heart of how philosophy works, but obviously, as you say, we reach a big crisis in the later Middle Ages when we have the scientific revolution. So that's the next thing to come on to and what happens there.